Dear friends, welcome to today's session. Today we will be talking about the birth and historical development of uh, the heritage concept. Heritage means something that is handed down from the past. The first meaning is recalls individual heritage, miras, uh, any entity that has been inherited from one's ancestors. Uh, Originally, in the primitive times, before the settled life of Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens, when people were hunter gatherers, one's heritage is composed of the belongings that he or she can carry. So these can be tools, weaponry, anything. This is the tangible heritage, and there are, of course, intangible heritage, which can be stories, myths, and language and other intangible components of culture. Uh, Particularly through the effect of wars and effects of wars and struggle about resources, uh, people were migrating continuously. But in some particular cases, there have been massive dislocations of certain ethnic or religious groups, like the dissolution of Roman Empire, for example. This is not the only one, but this is one of the examples of massive dislocations after the Holy Roman Empire have been divided first into four, then into two, and the Western Roman Empire have been dissolved very quickly. The Eastern Roman Empire stand for around 1,000 years, but continuously dissolved throughout the process. So there has been lots of dislocations. Some of the northern tribes in Europe have been moved south. The Turks, Persians, and other Muslim groups have been invaded some of the land of Roman Empire, coming from the east. And as people, as complete society, with all of its members have been migrated from one place to another, they have developed a certain sensitivity to the immobile assets that they have been left in their original land. So heritage is expanded from an individual domain to a community domain, and it has been shared. Certain sensitivity starts to be felt about particular spaces, particular buildings, or components of landscape, a particular tree, a farm, the fertility of the land, and the complete land, territories, cities, and countries have been included in the domain of heritage. As society begins to feel a shared feeling for some examples of these entities. So they value these entities depending on their connection, their ties with these entities. This is an example of such a shared feeling about the components of land and landscape. It expresses the feelings of an Indian tribe leader in America, North America, when they left their land. In fact, they sold their land to the United States government. However, this is a forced purchase, so they are obliged to leave this land in exchange of certain rights and assets. It is a pretty late example from mid-19th century. However, it is a very good example of expression of feelings of a clan for their land. And it expresses the formation of heritage concept as a shared feeling, as a shared entity. When heritage becomes shared and turns to a converted entity, it becomes cultural heritage or cultural property. Of course, natural property can also be included in the definition of heritage, but today we will mostly be speaking about cultural properties and cultural heritage in this sense. Cultural heritage is a modern concept, and it has been particularly developed after 14th, 15th century to 18th, 19th century, with the effects of particular ideologies of cornerstones such as Renaissance, Reform, Enlightenment, and finally modernization process. In the contemporary world, after mid-20th century, let's say, cultural heritage is expanded as the heritage of the whole mankind. Today, this notion of collective heritage of a society mostly turned out as the heritage of the whole society, heritage of the human mind. Because today we believe that although very distinct and distant it is, any culture is possess a certain role, generates certain effects for the development and shaping of all other cultures. So today, as the contemporary modern approach, we see heritage as mostly as the common heritage of the earth or all the humankind. And in this session, we will be inspecting this historical development of the modern heritage concept, beginning with the ideology. We will try to highlight certain corner points in 15th century, 16th, 17th, 18th century, particularly for the development of the heritage idea as an important component of modern thinking and modernization, if you like. Very closely related with the Renaissance, there is a tendency in Europe, particularly in aristocrat and middle class of Europe, for the rediscovery of antiquities. The components of the antique cultures, particularly in Italy, Greece, and Anatolia. Such sculptures, artwork, and other things were favored and tried to rediscovered, tried to understand, and European people tended to base their roots in connection with these antique cultures. They admired the aesthetic qualities of these antique artwork, beginning from Renaissance in 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. So this is an important factor in the development of heritage concept. They try to find their ancestors and their ancestors' art, aesthetic qualities, and stories, myths. They try to understand it, then they start to value it as a heritage of their own culture. One of the very important things in the history of Europe for shaping the modern Europe is the age of discoveries. In 15th and 16th centuries, particularly, Europe has been developed. European economies has been developed to a certain level. There is some population growth, and there are some technologies started to develop, and then the eastern way to the markets and raw materials of India and Asia is closed because of the Muslim domination, and somehow European countries have been pushed to look for new markets and new resources to the West. So discoveries started particularly initiated by Spanish and Portugal states, which is on the far west of Europe, and they first started to colonize western coast of Africa, and very shortly after the American coasts, and then larger journeys to the eastern coasts of America and even to India and Asian coasts on the east. You see that the first they reached to the coasts, but very short after they started to invade the inland. And then in very short time, there has been a continuity of discoveries and market operations. European countries started to colonize many of these distant cultures. They colonized them, they collect slaves from Africa, they sent them to America, and large lands of America have been cultivated with valuable products of sugar, coffee, and cotton. And then these products have been sent to Europe and then processed, sold, and then the same cycle starts again. So we have mercantilism, capitalism, enlightenment, and then modern thought. A very specific example and outcome, a very specific outcome of these discoveries, these visits to distant cultures, is curiosity cabinets, cabinet of curiosities, which has been a widely popular concept between aristocrats in Europe, beginning with 15th century and popularized in 16th century. This is a cabinet or a room of rare, interesting, bizarre things, objects of any kind, collected and demonstrated. Not initially, not any kind. Initially, we have the living organisms, not living organisms itself always, but the corpses filled with some material to stand like a sculpture, or even fossils, or any examples somehow conserved. So these are interesting animals that they don't have in Europe. So they collect them from their travels to Asia, to Africa, to Americas, and put them on display in certain spaces like this. And they show it to their friends. And it's a way of proving that one is rich, one has the ability and power to go distant cultures and collect rare things which you don't have, you don't see before. So this is a way of being cool, let's say, hava atmak gibi düşünebiliriz. So it is a fashion, it becomes a fashion between European aristocrats and later on middle class families. So value of a cabinet of curiosity depends on its richness and its variety and rarity. So they are not ordinary living organisms, but they're rare, and there are various examples. Later on, we Cabinet of Curiosities have been expanded to include any kind of entities, not only living organisms or representations of living organisms, but particularly in 16th century, we see items of any kind, but still with the same criteria, belonging to distant cultures or distant times also. So we have here, for example, we see some weaponry and some statues, some other kinds of tools. This can be ordinary daily life tools, but we don't have them in our own culture. So they are ordinary tools of distant cultures. And you see that they are not systematically organized. They are not categorized, they are not thematically grouped, but there's a mixture of different kinds, different variations. So this is more popular. So you see a man-made object from China, a weapon, and side by side, a small kind of animal filled with some material from Africa, and some other object again comes together. With all these things, we don't have the thematic organization, but on the contrary, there's a mixture and richness of variety. So it's not a learning process. They are not trying to convert them to a complete set of knowledge, but instead they have particular pieces of information, but lots of information as a mixture. When we come to 17th century, for example, paintings and sculptures and other artwork were also included in this Cabinet of Curiosities. So we have the entities from distant cultures from Asia, Africa, and Muslim world, Ottoman land. But we have also examples of our own cultures, but generally from a distant time period, like paintings of 300 years old, or sculptures of 100 years old. So these artistic heritage also begins to be collected and sometimes mixed with all these other examples of entities. So the Cabinet of Curiosity becomes a collection of entities from either distant cultures or distant time periods. But at the end, all these are rare examples, bizarre examples that we don't have in our ordinary life around. So they are attractive, they are interesting, they generate a curiosity, merak uyandıran objeler. And what about the buildings? Of course, this interest to the products of distant cultures is not limited with mobile entities. Buildings and landscape elements are also components of this interest. And since you cannot collect architectural objects and transfer them to your own land, although they managed to do it in the 19th century, but before that, how can you collect objects of architecture? European travelers began to produce albums of architectural examples, components of distant cultures. This is an example from Austrian Fischer von Erlach's album from the early 18th century, and you see a Chinese pagoda, kind of a Buddhist temple, which you can never see around Europe. At this point, you can also keep in mind that people are not such mobile at that time. There are visitors to distant land. There are people who go there for merchandise activities and some government representatives, but this is very limited to certain privileged individuals or sometimes groups of people. But in any case, this is a privilege, and ordinary people doesn't have the chance to visit other places. And I don't know the rates, but I think most of the people die in the same location and doesn't see anywhere else than he was or she was born in 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. If they don't dislocated because of a war or things like that. So they don't have the chance to see any distant cultures or their products. So this is still a very popular and interesting thing to see. And we have such albums of architectural entities. And this is from the same album, showing demonstrating an Ottoman mosque, components from the Islamic world and Islamic territories. Islamic cultures are also very popular in these albums. So we see fragments of architecture, even sometimes ruins and inscriptions and ornamentations. And instead of cabinets, we see albums of such cultural property. Reform movement is also has significant effects on the development of collective heritage concept. Reform begins with Martin Luther's famous declaration nailing of his objectives to the church. In Germany, Martin Luther is a German religious reformer and objects to the interpretation of the Catholic Church. In the beginning of the 16th century. This is a very important cornerstone on the development of Christian world, Western world, and it is a mark point for the separation of religious bodies and state governments. Of course, it is only a start. Martin Luther's a text against the conventional church has triggered a reform movement throughout Europe, and it has been approximately 1.5 centuries full of wars and relocations of religious groups. So you see in this map, the green areas are the Roman Catholic areas in mid-16th century. It has been decreased more after that time. And you see how other parts of Europe is divided into different colors. England has its own church after Henry and the stories, and the northern countries of Europe like Netherlands, Saxony, Norway, Sweden, some parts of Prussia, some parts of northern Germany, and some other parts in Midlands Europe have been turned to Lutheran Church or Calvinist Reformed Church. So this is in the religious wise, this is a purification and return to the roots of religion, to Holy Bible, and get rid of the interpretations. But for our point of view, it's very important to understand that it has caused massive relocations throughout whole Europe, and all of these relocations in parallel with the other effects of 15th and 16th century in Europe that we are already talking about. This has triggered the concept of heritage, and it has been broadened. The acceptance of heritage feelings have been broadened throughout Europe. Another important concept triggering the rediscovery of antiquities and revaluing of the components of antique cultures is the Grand Tour, which has been fashionable among European aristocrats to go to initially Rome in the 16th century. It starts with visits to Rome, particularly from England, London, then from others, spread to other aristocracies. They start to visit Rome, then they start to visit other parts, southern parts of Italy and Greece, and even in 17th and 18th century, the Anatolian coasts, Aegean coasts, and Mediterranean coasts, and Egypt. So in 17th century, it's a very particular European fashion. If you are like 21 years old, aristocrat, teenage man. It is like a part of your education and your aristocrat identity that you make this journey, the Grand Tour. It sometimes takes 1 year or 2 years. And as a noble person, you go to these places and you try to recognize these distant cultures, so particularly Mediterranean, East Mediterranean coast. And then collect some things and demonstrate them to your friends in your or your family's cabinet of curiosity. But this can be a typical setting when a European aristocrat goes to southern shores of Italy in maybe late 17th century or 18th century, because we see many ships there. Maybe it's too crowded. But what you see is what this young aristocrat gentleman sees is mostly some ruins of grandeur, antique buildings, and a wild landscape around it. Sometimes they have been mixed together. The landscape invades the ruins. And some components of the contemporary, for that time, local culture, like some people, local villages, farms, or some animal activity, and simple residential buildings. So Europeans are fascinated, at least some of them are fascinated with these scenes, and the concept of picturesque develops. Yeah, this is picturesque. The grandeur of Roman or antique Greece, or even Egyptian ruins, grandeur, buildings, very big and attractive buildings, but usually desolated and somehow deteriorated, bozulmuş, and some parts are fallen down and mixed with wild landscape invading the building. Usually there is there are some patina showing the traces of time on the buildings. And this is an aesthetics. This starts to be an aesthetic value in the European culture. It is not exactly the conventional beauty. It doesn't fit the proper features of beauty defined in Renaissance, but it has certain features that attracts people. It has a sublime quality and it's a picturesque value. And again, a feeling of owning and taking the entity back to your own land or house. It is an inseparable feature of European culture. So beginning with, I think particularly in 18th century, Europeans, before that, Europeans designed those picturesque gardens around their palaces or family houses of aristocrat families. But beginning with 18th century, they make reconstructions of buildings and even ruins of distant cultures in these picturesque gardens. First, this starts in England and then separated to other high-level aristocrat European families. So they visit these places, they are fascinated by the ruins and landscape and elements of local cultures all together. They love this picturesque perspective, this picturesque atmosphere, and they start to build it in their own land, beginning with the gardens and then copying the buildings, reconstructing fake copies of distant cultures. A Chinese pagoda, for example, you see in the lower left corner and on the right corner, we see a ruin. It's a Gothic ruin, but it's completely fake, built in an England garden, English garden. And there are mixtures of it, just like in the Cabinet of Curiosity. We have the mixtures of it. On front, you see, on one place you see Gothic components, and on very near side by side, you see other examples of other cultures. All they are mixed together. And all they are fake. With the landscape elements. We see that these particular pieces of information is tried to gather together and systematic approach to understand and categorize things is a widely accepted approach between many fields of science and research. We have the scientific methodology, for example, by French philosopher Descartes, or the origins of scientific method, or for example, we have the first encyclopedia by Diderot in mid 18th century, and approach to the components of heritage in the age of enlightenment
is very important for the modern approach to conservation and restoration because it introduced cultural paradigms and formulated concepts which effectively founded the modern conservation movement. Here we see two pages from a publication from 1823. It's a great example. Uh, history of titled History of Art through Monuments. Here, the French style, you see in each page concentrates to a specific architectural component and illustrates technical drawings of different buildings from different cultures side by side. For example, on the left, you see vaulting on the focus vaultings. How do you cover uh, the buildings? How do you build the walls in different cultures, in different buildings? So he makes a comparison. He compares different examples within each other, tries to find similarities and contrasting features. So he tries to understand the systematics of modeling. On the right page, we see facades this time, different facades with different properties, like you see Sofia on the second row from top in the beginning, and Pantheon and different buildings. And this time compares the elevations. So the Enlightenment approach, the scientific approach to divide the entities into its tiny features and understand the properties of these features through comparing them with each other, grouping them, classifying them. And so in the cabinet of curiosities, you don't have these classifications. You don't have each part of information is connected or compared within each other. There are pieces of information, pieces of examples of interesting, bizarre things only put together, collected and put together as a mixture. This time we start to group them for certain similarities and separate them based on their distinctive features. You take this, put together with this one, and you take these two and put to somewhere else. But this group has certain relations. This is another group composed of different examples which stands in a different position. So this systematization, categorization, or classification is very important. It's the comparative approach is a very fundamental approach for the Enlightenment and also throughout the development of heritage concept. German Winkelmann was another who contributed to this development by critical examination of ancient works of art, objects or monuments. So we can say that grand tours were the origins of tourism, modern tourism. And Winkelmann is accepted as the founder of art history and, in a way, archaeology. Modern art history and modern archaeology, because he uh, gave birth to the methods of verification of the facts from the origin. As a result, uh, here in the restoration, 18th century restoration of an obelisk, and you see some uh, hieroglyph writing on it, and some parts are diagonally cut because we have the hieroglyph on the left part, for example, but some of it was deteriorated, some parts were lost, and we don't know how to complete it. So we don't try to complete it, but we just indicate a neutral plane to uh, to indicate that we don't know how it has to be complete, how it was in its original state. So as a result, Winkelmann made a distinction between original and copy. Original is valuable, copy is not valuable, so we make a distinction. This is very important for the development of modern approach to heritage. Additionally, Winkelmann proposed a periodization with this grouping of the similarities. For example, he first proposed the periodization of Greek sculpture. So instead of grouping everything together, he grouped similarities and differentiated differences. He tries to understand how architecture changed in time. He wants to understand the development, the process, the linear process of development, which is in fact the organization of our courses depend. In 1789, we see the French Revolution and sorry, its impacts were spread widely throughout all Europe. It is important for its effects on changing the approach and appreciation of heritage buildings. Before that, mostly heritage buildings were uh, owned and maintained by the church because they are usually cathedrals, church, or similar religious buildings. And some other state buildings and palaces were also either ruled by the monarchy or the church. church. Uh, French Revolution strongly questioned the connections between these two, the church and the state, which was mixed together before and proposed a strict distinction, secularism between the authority of the church and the state. And so the church has been forced to its religious limits, to its religious domain, and the many buildings and the monarchy and the dispatched. So the historical buildings which were controlled by these authorities have been owned by the public, the people themselves. Of course, there has been some improper applications throughout the process of the revolution and the application of these principles. But at the end, as ideologically, uh, it proposed a new connection between the people and the objects of heritage. And this has been factored through the following decades. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, French Revolution triggered a nationalistic trend throughout the whole continent. And this nationalistic trend also uh, is very connected with the rise of heritage understanding throughout communities because it's politically connected with the ideology of nationalism. Nationalistic ideology tends to search for its roots in history, its glorious past, the victories and the developments of the nation in the past to make the members of the nation, contemporary members of the nation, feel pride with their past. So, important buildings related with the history of past of the nations, particularly grandeur buildings connected with the grandeur victories of a nation in the past, is a very important political, it has become a very important political representation for the nationalist governments and nationalist political ideologies. As a result of this, many governments tend to give importance for the maintenance of historical buildings and then restoration of them as well. As an example, when Napoleon, after the French Revolution, Napoleon conquered Rome, he sends a representative to visit the city and understand and report about the situation of the city and the historic buildings in the city. And his representative relates Napoleon that the city is like a museum, like the whole city is like a museum, but in a very bad situation. Requires considerable maintenance and restoration. So we have museum as a typology, private and state-owned museums. Start as small examples of the cabinet of curiosities. In some places, cabinet of curiosities have been converted to early museums. But this time, in the beginning of the 19th century, a representative of Napoleon goes to visit the city of Rome and writes that the whole city is like a museum. So it is the heritage idea is expanded to, to the scale of the entire city. But at the same time, he indicates that the city as requires restoration. So restorations and road repairs have been made, have been realized throughout Europe in many places, with the triggering effect of nationalistic ideas in 19th century, late 18th century, and 19th century. And in these restorations and road repair activities, the buildings and sites have been considerably modified and changed. This is an example of late 18th century or the beginning of 19th century Acropolis in Athens. At that time, the Greeks earned their independence from the Ottoman Empire, and an Austrian aristocrat had been announced as the King Otto I, who allows antiques and those picturesque settings and ornaments, all things about this culture, antique culture. Maybe it's connected. He has been assigned as the first king of Greece, and he assigned Leo von Klenze for designing the new master plan for Acropolis and surroundings. And in this operation, the picturesque setting of the ruins and the original composition of Acropolis has been very important. They intended to see Acropolis in a picturesque setting, but as it was in its original composition. You see here, similar to many important buildings in history, this area has been used by other cultures in time, and we see Ottoman houses, Turkish houses built in the Ottoman domination of Greece, built around Acropolis, so they become together as a mixture of Ottoman residential buildings and antique great buildings. And this is a demonstration of Klenze's master plan is complete for Acropolis and its sorry, surroundings. Here we see three important principles of the restoration. The picturesque setting of ruins is intended to be conserved, but not in the ruin form, but as the reconstruction of the buildings with the original material. And of course, this reconstruction covers, includes the demolition of additions in time, like Turkish houses there, and reintegrations will be clearly distinguished, as we have seen in the Mykonos obelisk, the original and the completions or interventions need to be indicated in the material, in the composition and so on. So similar to this approach, in many places in Europe, in building-wise, in site-wise, or in city-wise, lots of heritage buildings were repaired, restored to their original state, or intended to be restored to their original state, the original state. Sorry. The question is, how can you know about the original state? Because you don't have the required documentation, you don't have reliable resources, basically. You can make some deductions, you can make some analogies looking at the partial details of the building, and you can say that, okay, this part is like that, so the other part can be symmetrical, so it can be like that. Or you can make analogies with other buildings, you can make comparisons of buildings of similar cultures, similar locations, similar time periods. So you can make some deductions. And you can say that, like the Turkish houses in Acropolis, you can also do it in the building scale as well. These parts are additions. These are added by different cultures lately, so they are not original. So we can demolish these buildings, or we can get rid of these ornaments which were added later. So you try to find the original composition by making analogies, comparisons, and by clearing the future editions. And hundreds of buildings and some sites and cities sometimes have been restored in 18th century and 19th century with this approach. This is an example in building scale. It's a cathedral in Buda part of Budapest, Hungary. You see its composition before its restoration in 19th century, and on the bottom you see the restored building. They are very different. There is a high level of interpretation for the original composition of the building. Probably the architects have looked at similar examples to make comparisons to understand the Gothic origins of the building, so they get rid of the later interventions and try to, in a way, this time reconstruct the original Gothic building. This is called unity of style. You find the style of the building, the original style of the building, and you restore the building according to this original style. So you generate a unity of style, and this is nourished with all these nationalistic political ideas. Austria, Hungary Empire has been dissolved before this restoration, and Hungarians tried to highlight their Hungarian nationalistic traditions, identity, and architecture as well. On the other hand, this approach has been criticized severely. And the critics have highlighted that the authentic qualities of the buildings has been diminished through these restorations. So these are not restorations of the heritage. The heritage has been lost. These are new designs of the old styles. So we have the new and old separation, original and copy. We understand we know what's fake. We have the periodization, the systematic approach, categorization, classification of things, and we have the pictures, settings, and ruin aesthetics. So some people love this ruin quality, and they say that we lose the information about the building because you change the building, you make new designs, assuming that the original is like that, but you don't have reliable sources for this. And there's the ruin aesthetics that some people love and favor, even though trying to build the similar landscapes, similar buildings, reconstructions in their own land. Parallel with the age of romanticism, these critics start to begin with the paintings. Paintings were also restored. However, these critics, when looking at an old painting, there is a tail effect, tail fade effect on the painting. There is a layer of tail effect on many historical paintings, which is called patina. It is a mixture of dust and some other weathering materials that is covered on the filling on the painting, and you see a pale effect which increases the nostalgic effect, nostalgia and romanticism of the experience when you are looking at the painting. So the critics criticized restorators of these paintings for losing this patina. You have to not lose the patina, they say, because the paintings are more enjoyable with the patina, because the patina makes the observer to feel that nostalgia to the past. They want to feel that nostalgia, they want to feel that experience. It's individuality, purification of the original, restoration of ancient theories. And then this approach spread to the field of architecture, from paintings, and a movement called anti-restoration have been take place in the 19th century, in early 19th century, beginning from England and spreading out to Germany, France, and other countries. The anti-restoration movement criticized restoration architects for the destruction of the historical authenticity of buildings and fought for their protection, conservation, and maintenance. The leading actor of this critic surroundings is John Ruskin, an aesthetic theorist at the same time. Uh, who is strictly against the restoration of the building. But you need to understand that restoration in that context of that time and particular place in history, restoration means the restorations like font lenses or the example in Budapest, restorations made in the unity of style approach by names like Viola Legi, for example. So, as John Ruskin's approach has been accepted by architectural surroundings, restoration term in the English language has gained a negative meaning, like giving various harms to the building or the ruins. And in time, it was replaced by the word conservation. John Ruskin values all the traces of time, weathering, the human effects, the human interventions to the building as its primary features. So the building was built in some time, and as the time has passed and the building, like a living organism, has been altered by natural factors and man-made factors. So as an entity, as a whole, it's valuable. You cannot separate the traces of alterations, change, or even the traces of craftsmanship, the stonemakers, simple plain signs of these tools. They are all valuable for the objects of assets of cultural heritage. As being in Venice, and these drawings are from Venice. In these drawings, we see another important concept. We see the buildings with their context. The context includes the landscape, geography, topography, or man-made entities around the building, the climate, the weather, everything. Here, another example from John Ruskin's Venice paintings, mid-19th century. You see all the deteriorations, the losses or material losses or material deteriorations. Deterioration means bozulma in Turkish. It covers all the chemical and physical factors changing the composition of the building material. So based on John Ruskin's ideas, very parallel with anti-restoration law, there is a conservation law. John Ruskin and his followers are against restoration, do not make restoration, do not make any interventions to the building, do not design historical details and spaces. So do not touch the buildings. But for the conservation purposes, some reinforcements to the structure or in some more developed places for the conservation material compositions, you can make some interventions to conserve them. So we love the real aesthetics, we love the pictures setting, we love all the traces by weathering natural conditions or man-made, and we need to conserve and maintain the building, keep the building in its uh, structural and compositional uh, uniform state. So the building stands as a catalog of all these events in time. Uh, this is particularly modern. This completes our inspection for the roots of uh, modern approach to heritage, our shared cultural heritage. So we have the differentiation of old and new. We have the periodization, we understand the periods, their features, their styles, and we are against the reconstructions and interpretations based on non-reliable sources. So we have the uh, reliability of sources is an important parameter. And uh, we have the importance of the picturesque uh, view or the importance of the ruin aesthetics. So we cannot make a hierarchy for the interventions to the building. Uh, in a particular, we cannot uh, privilege to a certain period or to a certain style all the interventions, all the modifications has a certain historical dimension. And all of them are together, all the traces of all modifications, all the history of the pardon, are valuable as a whole. We don't restore or reconstruct buildings, but we try to keep them in their state with maximum information, with maximum document value for its history, what we try to maintain the building and take some conservative measures for protecting the uniform composition of the contemporary state of the building or the ruin. This is somehow all the important layers that build up the modern approach to heritage. So we are trying to understand the basic corner points for each of these uh, layers of modern approach. Finally, this is Collegium in Rome, and this is a good example, I think, of a modern conservation project. Of course, it is restored several times in time, However, it is like a reflection of Ruskin's ideas, uh, which can be accepted as the fundamental of the modern approach to modern conservation theory. Here we see a catalog of uh, various effects of time and man-made factors in history on the roots of Colosseum. And also there are some restoration interventions. However, it was not reconstructed. Unknown or missing parts are not completed except some examples like on the lower right edge, we see some steps were finished with stone material as it was in the Roman times. And the platform was not rebuilt, but a part of it, like one third of it, was built, but not as in its original state as a stone construction, but as a temporary wooden and steel construction, which is lighter, which is uh, not misleading as if it was original. And you see there are other various construction details from various time periods. You see how the spaces are covered with different layerings. You see the upper walls which were not completed to the other side. So you see all the interventions, all the layers of history, including all the examples of restoration and conservation measures. Thank you for listening to me today. This was an introduction. For more information about the modern approach to the concept of heritage and furthermore conservation and restoration approach, uh, you can attend to some elective classes in our faculty in your future education. And additionally, uh, in the fourth year restoration and conservation studio, we will be together in the Department of Architecture students for discussing details of this approach. Additionally, there are two books here for the ones who wish to read more on the history of conservation and restoration. Take care of yourself. See you online.